She was just restocking the medical supply cabinets when the nurses started their usual conversation about weekend plans and war stories from the ER. Latex gloves snapping against wrists, the familiar smell of antiseptic hanging in the air like morning fog. Her cart squeaked softly as she moved between the storage rooms at Mercy General Hospital, methodically counting bandages and checking expiration dates on IV bags. 26 years old, shoulder-length auburn hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same faded scrubs that had seen too many 12-hour shifts, until a trauma surgeon walked into the supply room, took one look at the inventory spreadsheet in her hands, and asked if she'd ever seen combat. Didn't assume she hadn't. Didn't laugh at the possibility. Just asked. And in that moment, every assumption about the quiet girl from medical supplies was about to shatter like glass hitting concrete. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fourth floor of Mercy General had its own ecosystem. Different from the chaos of the emergency department 3 floors below, different from the hushed intensity of the ICU on 7. Here in the medical supply wing, the rhythm was steady and predictable. Carts rolling down linoleum hallways, the distant ping of elevator doors, the soft murmur of nurses discussing patient charts at the central station. It smelled like industrial soap and latex, with undertones of that particular hospital air that never quite felt fresh, no matter how hard the ventilation system worked. Emma Caldwell moved through this world like she was part of the architecture. Her supply cart had a wobbly front wheel that announced her arrival about 30 seconds before she appeared around any corner. She'd learned to navigate around the morning medication rounds, the shift changes, the daily rhythm of a hospital that never slept. Her movements were efficient but unhurried, checking off items on her clipboard with the same careful attention, whether she was restocking something as simple as tongue depressors or as critical as emergency intubation kits. The other staff barely noticed her anymore. She'd been working medical supply for 8 months now, long enough to become invisible in the way that support staff often did. They saw the cart, they saw the fresh supplies appearing in their cabinets, but Emma herself had become background noise. Just another young woman in faded purple scrubs, doing a job that kept the hospital running but didn't require a medical degree or years of specialized training. Her workstation was a converted storage room on the east side of the building, cramped but organized with military precision. Shelves lined every wall, labeled and color-coded according to a system that made sense to her but looked like chaos to anyone else. Cardiac supplies in red bins, respiratory equipment in blue, surgical materials in green. Everything had its place, everything was accounted for, and everything was always exactly where it needed to be when someone came looking for it. The morning inventory was Emma's favorite part of the day. Before the hospital fully woke up, before the controlled chaos of patient care filled every corner, she could work in relative quiet. Her clipboard held sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting, tracking usage patterns and supply levels, with the kind of attention to detail that most people reserve for much more important tasks. She knew which departments burned through gauze fastest, which nurses hoarded extra syringes in their personal supplies, which doctors had a habit of taking more sutures than they actually needed. Dr. Patricia Reynolds was making her usual rounds when she stopped by the supply room. She was one of the newer residents, fresh out of medical school and still carrying herself with the particular combination of confidence and uncertainty that came with having all the knowledge but none of the experience. Her white coat was still pristine, her stethoscope positioned just so. Everything about her appearance carefully constructed to project competence. "Morning, Emma," she said, not really looking up from her tablet as she entered the storage area. "I need to grab some extra IV starter kits for the afternoon shift. We're expecting a busy day in the ER." Emma nodded and pointed toward the appropriate section. "Third shelf, blue bins. There's a fresh case that came in yesterday morning." Dr. Reynolds gathered what she needed, then paused, glancing around the immaculately organized space. "You know, I've been meaning to ask, how do you keep track of all this? The inventory system here is more complex than some of the diagnostic protocols we learned in school." Quote, "Practice," Emma said simply, making a note on her clipboard. "Once you understand the patterns, it's just a matter of staying ahead of demand." Patterns? Emma looked up for the first time, her gray-green eyes focusing on the resident with sudden intensity. Usage spikes on weekends, seasonal variations for respiratory supplies, the way different departments consume materials based on caseloads and staff experience levels. Everything follows patterns if you know how to read them. Dr. Reynolds frowned slightly. That's remarkably analytical for inventory management. Emma went back to her clipboard without responding, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The conversation was over, but the resident lingered for a moment, studying the young woman with the clipboard like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't know existed. The nurse's station buzzed with its usual mid-morning energy when Emma wheeled her cart past 20 minutes later. 3 nurses clustered around the central desk, and their conversation carried the easy familiarity of people who'd worked together long enough to develop their own shorthand. "Did you see the new trauma surgeon they brought in from Johns Hopkins?" Nurse Amanda Chen was saying, pulling up something on her computer screen. "Dr. Marcus Webb. Apparently he's got experience with field medicine and worked with military medical units overseas." "Great," replied Sarah Martinez, the charge nurse whose 12 years on the floor had earned her a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency. Another doctor who thinks he knows how things work because he read about it in a textbook. "Actually," the third nurse, Jennifer Walsh, leaned in conspiratorially, "I heard he's the real deal. Combat experience, not just training exercises. Word is he's seen things that would make our worst trauma cases look like paper cuts." Emma's cart squeaked to a stop. She was checking the crash cart supplies, but her hands had gone very still on her clipboard. "Combat experience doesn't mean much when you're dealing with civilian trauma," Sarah said dismissively. "Different equipment, different protocols, different everything. Military medicine is all about keeping people alive long enough to get them to a real hospital." "Maybe," Amanda said, "but I'll take someone who's worked under pressure over someone who's only ever practiced in a controlled environment." Quote. Emma resumed her inventory, but she was listening now with the kind of focused attention that most people missed. Her pen moved across the checklist, but her mind was processing the conversation with a different kind of awareness. "Besides," Jennifer added, "what do any of us really know about military medicine anyway? It's not like any of us have been there." The comment hung in the air for a moment. Emma finished checking the defibrillator pads and moved to the next item on her list. Oxygen masks. Sizes adult and pediatric. Check. Airway management tools. Complete set. Check. Her handwriting remained steady, but something behind her eyes had changed. "True enough," Sarah agreed. "Though I sometimes wonder what it would be like, working in those conditions, making life-and-death decisions with limited resources and people shooting at you." "Romantic nonsense," Amanda laughed. "It's probably mostly boredom and bureaucracy, just like everything else in the military. All that Hollywood drama about heroic medics saving lives under fire is just that, Hollywood." Emma's pen stopped moving entirely for exactly 2 seconds. Then she completed her notation and moved to the next supply cabinet. Dr. Webb appeared at the nurse's station just as Emma was finishing her rounds. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of tan that came from spending time outdoors and laugh lines that suggested he smiled easily. His scrubs were standard hospital issue, but he wore them with a casualness that spoke of long familiarity with working clothes that needed to be practical above all else. "Morning," he said to the group of nurses. "I'm looking for whoever manages medical supply inventory. I wanted to discuss some modifications to the trauma bay equipment setup." Sarah gestured toward Emma, who was securing the last of her supplies and preparing to move her cart to the next floor. "That would be Emma. She handles all the inventory and supply distribution for this wing." Dr. Webb turned toward her, and Emma found herself being studied with the kind of attention that felt different from the casual dismissal she was used to from most of the medical staff. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they carried a particular quality of alertness that she recognized but couldn't immediately place. "Emma," he said, extending his hand, "Marcus Webb. I just transferred in from Baltimore. I understand you're the person to talk to about equipment availability and distribution protocols." She shook his hand briefly. His grip was firm without being aggressive, and his palm had the slight calluses that came from physical work, not just paperwork and patient examinations. "What kind of modifications did you have in mind?" she asked. "I'm used to working with field surgical kits that are organized differently from standard hospital setups," he explained. "More compact, different priority systems for critical supplies. I was hoping to discuss adapting some of the trauma bay configurations to incorporate those principles." Emma nodded slowly. Field surgical kits. Military standard? Among others. His response was carefully neutral, but he was watching her face as he said it. The trauma bays here are set up according to standard civilian protocols, she said. But they could be modified to incorporate triage-based supply accessibility without disrupting existing workflows. Dr. Webb's eyebrows rose slightly. Are you familiar with triage-based supply systems? I'm familiar with efficient resource allocation under pressure, Emma replied, her tone remaining perfectly professional. The principles are adaptable regardless of the specific environment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There was a moment of silence that felt charged with unspoken questions. Dr. Webb was clearly trying to determine whether her response indicated real knowledge or just good guessing, while Emma seemed to be calculating exactly how much expertise she wanted to reveal. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, he said finally. Perhaps we could schedule a time to go through the current setup and discuss potential improvements. I'm usually in the supply room between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, Emma said. That's when most departments are between shift changes, so there are fewer interruptions. I'll stop by this afternoon, then. Dr. Webb nodded to the group of nurses and headed toward the elevator. As soon as he was out of earshot, Amanda leaned toward Emma with obvious curiosity. Well, that was interesting. What do you think of our new combat veteran? Emma was organizing her clipboard, securing it to her cart with a bungee cord that had seen better days. He seems competent. Just competent? Jennifer pressed. Come on, Emma, the man has combat experience. Doesn't that seem exciting? Exciting isn't the word I'd use, Emma said quietly. She pushed her cart toward the elevator, the squeaky wheel announcing her departure. Experience is experience. What matters is whether he can adapt it to work here. The nurses watched her go, exchanging glances that suggested they found her response unusually subdued, even for Emma. The elevator carried her to the 6th floor, where the surgical wing maintained its own separate ecosystem of controlled sterility and focused intensity. Here, the supply requirements were different, more specialized, more expensive, more critical. A missing clamp or an improperly sterilized instrument could mean the difference between successful surgery and catastrophic complications. Emma's rounds on surgery took longer because everything required more detailed checking. Surgical packs needed to be verified for completeness and sterility. Instrument trays had to be inspected for proper organization. Anesthesia supplies required careful monitoring for expiration dates and proper storage conditions. It was detail-oriented work that most people found tedious, but Emma approached it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. Dr. Jennifer Hawkins, the chief of surgery, was reviewing patient charts when Emma entered the main surgical supply room. She was a woman in her early 50s who had earned her position through 30 years of excellence and an absolute intolerance for anything less than perfection. Her gray hair was pulled back in a surgical cap even when she wasn't operating, and her scrubs were always immaculate. Emma, she said without looking up from her paperwork, I need to discuss the new inventory tracking system with you. Administration is pushing for digital integration with the hospital's main database, but I want to make sure it won't disrupt our current efficiency levels. What kind of digital integration? Emma asked, pulling up the surgical supply checklist on her tablet. Barcode scanning, automated reorder systems, real-time usage tracking. The usual technological solution to problems that don't actually exist. Dr. Hawkins's tone suggested her opinion of administrative innovation. Emma considered this while checking the contents of a cardiovascular surgery pack. Automated systems can improve accuracy if they're properly configured, but they tend to lose efficiency when they can't account for situational variables. Exactly my concern. In surgery, situational variables are everything. A system that can't adapt to changing conditions is worse than useless. It's dangerous. The key would be maintaining manual override capabilities while using the automated features for routine tracking, Emma said. Hybrid systems that let human judgment take precedence when necessary. Dr. Hawkins looked up from her charts for the first time, studying Emma with renewed interest. You seem to have given this considerable thought. Inventory management is about predicting needs and maintaining readiness, Emma replied. Whether the system is digital or analog doesn't matter as much as whether it serves that purpose effectively. Predicting needs and maintaining readiness, Dr. Hawkins repeated slowly. That's an interesting way to phrase it, almost sounds like logistics planning. Emma's hands continued their methodical checking of surgical supplies, but her response was careful. Good inventory management is essentially logistics planning, just on a smaller scale. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Webb's voice from the doorway. "Excuse me, Dr. Hawkins. I was looking for Emma to discuss some equipment modifications for the trauma bay." "Of course," Dr. Hawkins said. "Though I'd be interested in hearing about these modifications myself. Any changes to trauma bay protocols affect surgical prep time and resource allocation." Dr. Webb entered the supply room, and Emma found herself between two doctors who were both looking at her with the kind of attention she usually tried to avoid. The space felt smaller suddenly, more focused. "The modifications I had in mind are primarily about organization and accessibility," Dr. Webb explained. "Arranging critical supplies according to triage priority rather than alphabetical or categorical systems." "Triage priority," Dr. Hawkins mused. "That assumes a level of battlefield medical experience that most of our staff doesn't have." "Not battlefield specifically," Dr. Webb said carefully, "but emergency medicine in high-stress environments where resource allocation becomes critical." Emma continued her inventory, but she was listening to every word. When she spoke, her voice was calm and professional. Triage-based organization works well if the staff is trained to think in terms of critical interventions rather than standard procedures. The challenge is maintaining system integrity when personnel change or when non-emergency cases create workflow confusion. Both doctors turned to look at her. Dr. Webb's expression was thoughtful, while Dr. Hawkins looked surprised. "That's a remarkably sophisticated analysis," Dr. Hawkins said slowly. "Where did you learn about triage-based medical logistics?" Emma finished counting the contents of an orthopedic surgery pack before answering. "Previous experience with resource allocation under pressure." It wasn't really an answer, but it wasn't evasive either. It was the kind of response that acknowledged the question without providing information, delivered with the same calm professionalism that characterized everything else about Emma Caldwell. Dr. Webb was watching her with increased interest now, but he didn't press for details. Instead, he said, "I'd still like to discuss the trauma bay modifications this afternoon, if you're available." "I'll be in the supply room at 2, Emma confirmed, securing her tablet and preparing to move to the next area on her rounds. As she pushed her squeaky cart toward the elevator, both doctors remained in the surgical supply room, but their conversation had taken on a different tone, less casual, more speculative, as if they were both trying to solve a puzzle that had just become more complex than they'd expected. The break room on the 4th floor had that particular atmosphere of enforced relaxation that hospitals cultivated. Mismatched chairs around a scratch table, a coffee machine that worked half the time, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. It was here, during the afternoon shift change, that conversations turned from patient care to personal observations, and where Emma Caldwell had unknowingly become a frequent topic of discussion. "I swear that girl lives in the supply room," said Kevin Morrison, a physical therapy assistant who'd been at Mercy General for 3 years. He was stirring sugar into coffee that already looked too strong, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness of someone commenting on hospital fixtures. "I've never seen her anywhere else. Not the cafeteria, not the parking garage, nowhere." "She's probably too shy to eat with real people," added Lisa Brennan, a medical technician whose afternoon shift overlapped with Emma's supply rounds. "I tried to make conversation with her last week about the weather, and she just nodded and kept pushing that squeaky cart. It's like talking to a wall." Dr. Rachel Foster, a second-year resident, looked up from her phone where she'd been scrolling through medical journals. "Maybe she's just focused on her job." "Nothing wrong with that." "Focused is one thing," Kevin replied, "but this girl is like a robot. Same routine every day, same order for everything, same blank expression. It's weird." The conversation was interrupted by Nurse Patricia Williams, entering with an armload of patient files and a look of mild frustration. She'd been at Mercy General for 8 years and had developed strong opinions about efficiency and competence during that time. "Speaking of the supply room," Patricia said, dropping into an empty chair, "Emma messed up my order again. I specifically requested extra wound care supplies for room 314, and she gave me exactly what was on the standard list. Nothing extra." Dr. Foster frowned. "Did you submit a modified request form?" "I told her verbally when she was doing rounds. She should have written it down or made a note or something. That's basic customer service." "Maybe she forgot," Lisa suggested, "or maybe she didn't understand what you were asking for." How hard is it to understand I need extra supplies? Patricia's voice was rising slightly. I mean, we're not talking about complex medical procedures here. It's just counting and organizing. A high school student could do that job. Kevin nodded in agreement. That's what I don't understand. How did she even get hired? Did anyone check her qualifications? Her experience? Because from what I can see, she has zero background in healthcare. Actually, Dr. Foster said carefully, her work seems pretty thorough. I've never had issues with supply availability or organization in any of the areas she covers. That's because you're easy to please, Patricia said dismissively. Try working with demanding patients and critical care situations where every minute matters. When you need something specific, and it's not there because the supply girl couldn't be bothered to think beyond her basic checklist, then you'll understand my frustration. The break room door opened again, and Emma appeared with her cart, clearly making routine rounds to check the emergency supply cabinet mounted near the entrance. She moved efficiently, checking contents against her clipboard without acknowledging the group of staff members at the table. Perfect timing, Kevin muttered under his breath. Watch this. He raised his voice slightly. Hey, Emma, question for you. When you're restocking the physical therapy supplies, could you make sure to include extra resistance bands? We go through them faster than the standard allocation accounts for. Emma paused in her inventory checking and turned toward him. Resistance bands are classified under durable medical equipment. Increased allocation requires a department supervisor request through the proper channels. Right, but I'm telling you directly that we need more. Can't you just grab a few extra from whatever storage area you have? Supply distribution follows established protocols to ensure fair allocation across all departments, Emma replied, her tone remaining perfectly neutral. If physical therapy requires increased quantities, the request needs to come through your department supervisor with justification for the variance. Kevin looked around the table with an expression of vindicated frustration. See what I mean? It's like talking to a computer program. No flexibility, no common sense, just rules and procedures. Emma completed her cabinet check and made a notation on her clipboard. As she prepared to leave, Patricia called out to her. Emma, about that wound care order I mentioned earlier. You only brought the standard supplies, but I specifically told you I needed extra for a difficult case. Quote. Emma turned back, her gray-green eyes focusing on Patricia with careful attention. Standard wound care protocols are calculated based on average patient needs per room per day. Additional supplies beyond standard allocation require documentation of medical necessity and approval from the nursing supervisor. I don't need approval to do my job properly, Patricia said, her voice sharpening. I need supplies when I ask for them. Supply variance without proper documentation creates inventory discrepancies that affect other departments, Emma explained. If you need additional materials for specific cases, the request process ensures adequate tracking and replacement ordering. Lisa laughed, but not kindly. God, does she always talk like she's reading from a manual? Supply variance, adequate tracking. It's like she learned English from a business textbook. Maybe she did, Kevin said. Maybe this is her first job ever, and she's trying too hard to sound professional. Dr. Foster shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She's just trying to do her job according to the rules. There's nothing wrong with following procedures. Following procedures is fine, Patricia replied, but so is using your brain. When a nurse tells you she needs extra supplies for patient care, you don't lecture her about documentation requirements. You get the supplies and figure out the paperwork later. Emma's expression hadn't changed throughout this conversation, but she was listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was processing more than just the immediate complaints about supply protocols. In emergency situations, she said quietly, rapid resource deployment takes priority over standard documentation. But routine requests for additional materials should follow established channels to prevent resource shortages in other critical areas. The break room went silent for a moment. Kevin stared at her with genuine confusion. Emergency situations? We're talking about wound dressings, not battlefield medicine. What kind of emergencies do you think happen in the supply room? Emma's pause was so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed it. Any situation where resource availability affects patient outcomes. Patient outcomes, Lisa repeated slowly. You're a supply clerk. You count bandages and stack boxes. When exactly did you become an expert on patient outcomes? I'm not an expert on anything, Emma said simply. I just understand resource allocation. She pushed her cart toward the door, but Kevin wasn't finished. "Resource allocation," he said mockingly. Jesus Christ, she really does talk like a textbook. "Hey, Emma, where did you learn to talk like that? Business school? Community college management program?" Emma stopped at the doorway without turning around. Previous experience. Previous experience doing what? Managing a warehouse? Working at Walmart? This time Emma did turn around, and for just a moment something flickered behind her calm expression. Previous experience with situations where resource allocation meant the difference between mission success and mission failure. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. Mission success. Mission failure. These weren't terms that belonged in hospital break room conversations about supply distribution. Dr. Foster looked genuinely curious now. What kind of missions? But Emma was already gone, the sound of her squeaky cartwheel fading down the hallway. "Missions," Kevin said with exaggerated amazement. "She thinks counting medical supplies is a mission. That's either really dedicated or really delusional." "Maybe she's a former military," Dr. Foster suggested. "That would explain the formal language and the focus on procedures." Patricia snorted. "Military, her? Look at her. She's maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, afraid to make eye contact, and can't handle basic communication without falling back on rules and regulations. What branch of the military takes people like that?" "Plenty of military jobs don't require physical combat," Dr. Foster pointed out. "Administrative roles, technical support, logistics." "Logistics," Lisa interrupted with a laugh. "Yeah, maybe she was in charge of ordering toilet paper for the mess hall. That would explain her obsession with proper documentation." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Webb entering the break room, clearly looking for coffee between his afternoon appointments. He nodded to the group and headed for the coffee machine, which chose that moment to make concerning mechanical noises. "Great," he muttered, trying the brew button again. "Having supply problems, Dr. Webb?" Kevin asked with obvious amusement. "Maybe you should file a formal request with proper documentation." "That seems to be how things work around here." Dr. Webb looked confused. "I'm sorry?" Quote, "We were just discussing the fascinating world of hospital supply management," Patricia explained. "Apparently, getting extra bandages requires the same level of bureaucracy as ordering nuclear weapons." "You mean Emma?" Dr. Webb asked, abandoning the coffee machine. "The woman who handles medical supplies?" "That's the one," Lisa said. "We were just wondering where someone learns to talk like a military contractor about basic inventory management." Dr. Webb's expression shifted slightly, becoming more attentive. "Military contractor?" "Not literally," Kevin clarified. "But she talks like everything is a mission, and resource allocation, and protocols. It's like she learned customer service from a Pentagon manual." "Interesting," Dr. Webb said thoughtfully. "I had a conversation with her earlier about Trauma Bay organization. She seemed remarkably knowledgeable about triage-based logistics." "Triage-based logistics," Patricia repeated with obvious skepticism. "For a supply clerk who's probably never seen anything more traumatic than a paper cut. Where do these people learn this terminology?" "Military training would be one place," Dr. Webb suggested carefully. "Military training for what?" Lisa asked. "Like I said before, what branch of the military takes someone like Emma? She can barely handle a conversation about wound dressings without quoting procedure manuals." Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, but his expression suggested he was thinking about something specific. "Not all military roles require aggressive personalities or combat readiness. Some of the most critical military positions require people who can work efficiently under pressure while maintaining strict attention to detail." "Such as?" Kevin prompted. "Logistics coordination, medical support, intelligence analysis, roles where precision and reliability matter more than physical presence." Patricia looked unconvinced. "You're giving her way too much credit. She's probably just someone who takes a simple job too seriously and uses big words to make herself feel important." "Maybe," Dr. Webb said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Though I've found that people who use precise terminology usually have specific reasons for doing so." The break room door opened again, and Nurse Martinez entered with obvious frustration written across her face. "Did anyone else have problems with the afternoon supply delivery?" she asked. "I'm missing half my requested items for the cardiac care unit." Let me guess, Patricia said with satisfaction. Emma couldn't be bothered to read the full request list. Actually, no, Martinez replied, checking her notes. Everything I requested was there, plus several items I didn't ask for but definitely needed. Somehow she anticipated that we'd have higher than normal demand for cardiac monitoring supplies today. Kevin frowned. How would she know that? I have no idea, Martinez admitted. But she was right. We had 3 unexpected cardiac cases this afternoon, and if she hadn't included those extra supplies, we would have been scrambling to find them. The conversation died for a moment as everyone processed this information. Dr. Foster spoke first. That's actually pretty impressive. Predicting supply needs requires understanding patient flow patterns and medical trends. Or lucky guessing, Lisa said dismissively. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. But Dr. Webb looked genuinely interested now. Did she say anything about why she included the extra supplies? I asked her, Martinez said. She just said something about, quote, anticipated variance based on seasonal cardiac presentation patterns, which sounds made up, but the supplies were exactly what we needed. Seasonal cardiac presentation patterns, Dr. Webb repeated slowly. That's epidemiological terminology. Epidemiological? Patricia asked. The study of disease patterns in populations. It's advanced medical statistics, usually taught at the graduate level. Kevin shook his head in disbelief. So now we're supposed to believe that the supply girl has graduate-level medical education? Come on. I'm not saying she has formal education, Dr. Webb clarified. But that terminology suggests exposure to advanced medical logistics planning. Advanced medical logistics planning, Lisa said mockingly. For someone whose job is basically being a human vending machine for hospital supplies. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Jennifer Hawkins, the chief of surgery, who entered the break room with the brisk efficiency that characterized everything she did. Good, Dr. Webb, I was looking for you, she said. I wanted to follow up on our discussion about trauma bay modifications. I spoke with Emma about the logistics implications, and she made some interesting observations about resource flow optimization. What kind of observations? Dr. Webb asked. She suggested that trauma bay efficiency could be improved by implementing what she called graduated accessibility protocols, organizing supplies not just by medical priority, but by the statistical likelihood of need based on injury type and severity. Patricia looked around the table with an expression of growing disbelief. Graduated accessibility protocols? Statistical likelihood? Are we talking about the same person who can't handle a simple request for extra bandages? Dr. Hawkins looked genuinely puzzled. Extra bandages? Patricia had some issues with supply request earlier, Dr. Foster explained diplomatically. What kind of issues? Patricia launched into her explanation about the wound care supplies, but Dr. Hawkins was frowning before she finished. You made a verbal request for additional supplies without going through proper channels? It was just a few extra bandages. And you expected her to override established inventory protocols based on an undocumented verbal request? Patricia's confident expression was beginning to waver. Well, when you put it like that. Hospital supply management requires strict documentation for auditing and regulatory compliance, Dr. Hawkins continued. Verbal requests for additional materials, no matter how well-intentioned, create accountability gaps that can result in serious problems during inspections. The break room had gone very quiet. Emma was absolutely correct to require proper documentation, Dr. Hawkins concluded. That's not bureaucracy. That's professional competence. Kevin cleared his throat uncomfortably. We didn't realize the documentation was that important. Documentation is everything in hospital management, Dr. Webb added, especially in supply allocation. One undocumented variance can cascade into inventory shortages that affect patient care across multiple departments. Lisa looked around the table with growing embarrassment. So she was just doing her job correctly? She was doing her job extremely well, Dr. Hawkins said firmly. And based on my conversation with her about trauma bay logistics, she's doing it with a level of sophistication that most supply management professionals would find impressive. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the implications of this conversation settled over the group. Dr. Foster spoke carefully. So when we were criticizing her for following procedures, you were criticizing her for being competent, Dr. Webb finished. Patricia's face had gone red. But she talks so formally, like she's trying to sound more important than she is. Or, Dr. Hawkins suggested, like she's accustomed to working in environments where precision in communication is critical. "What kind of environment?" Kevin asked quietly. Dr. Webb and Dr. Hawkins exchanged a look that suggested they were both thinking the same thing, but neither wanted to be the first to say it. "Environments where mistakes have serious consequences," Dr. Webb said finally, "where resource allocation decisions affect lives, and where precise communication prevents misunderstandings that could be catastrophic." The break room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, less comfortable, more thoughtful. And somewhere down the hallway, Emma Caldwell continued her afternoon rounds, checking supplies and maintaining inventories with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, unaware that the conversation about her competence had just taken a very different turn. The emergency department at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon had its own particular energy. Not the controlled chaos of weekend nights or the steady flow of Monday morning follow-ups, but the unpredictable rhythm of a hospital that never knew what was coming through its doors next. Emma was restocking the trauma bay supply cabinets when she heard the radio crackle from the nurses' station. "Mercy General, this is Ambulance 74. We have a multi-vehicle accident en route. ETA 12 minutes. 3 vehicles involved, 5 patients total. 1 priority is red, 2 yellow, 2 green." The response was immediate and efficient. Trauma team activation, surgical standby, blood bank notification. Emma continued her methodical supply checking, but her movements had subtly changed. She was listening to everything now, processing information with a different kind of attention. Priority red is a 28-year-old male, unconscious, suspected internal bleeding, possible traumatic brain injury, the paramedic's voice continued. "Vitals are BP dropping, pulse thready. We've got 2 large-bore IVs running, but he's going to need immediate surgical intervention." Dr. Webb appeared at the trauma bay entrance, pulling on gloves as he surveyed the space. Emma was finishing her inventory of the airway management supplies, but she glanced up as he entered. "How are we looking for massive transfusion protocol supplies?" he asked, not really directing the question to anyone in particular. "Standard MTP setup is complete," Nurse Martinez called from across the bay. "Blood bank has been notified, but they'll need 15 minutes minimum for cross-match and delivery." Emma looked up from her clipboard. O-negative blood products are available in the emergency blood refrigerator. 6 units packed red cells, 4 units fresh frozen plasma, 1 unit platelets. Uncross-matched, but immediately available. Dr. Webb turned toward her with sharp attention. "Where's the emergency blood refrigerator?" "Medication room 3, behind the cardiac drugs. Access code is 7-7-4-9. "How do you know the access code for emergency blood products?" Emma's pause was so brief it was almost imperceptible. "I know all the access codes for critical supply areas." "All of them?" "All of them that affect patient care." Dr. Webb was staring at her now with obvious curiosity, but the approaching sirens cut off any further questions. Emma gathered her supplies and moved her cart out of the trauma bay, but she didn't go far. Instead, she positioned herself in the supply alcove where she could see everything that was happening. The first ambulance arrived with the priority red patient, and Emma watched Dr. Webb work with the kind of focused attention that most people reserve for watching movies. His movements were quick and decisive, but there was something about his technique that seemed different from the other emergency physicians she'd observed. More direct, more aggressive, less concerned with standard protocols than with immediate results. "I need a thoracotomy tray," Dr. Webb called out as he assessed the patient's deteriorating condition. "Thoracotomy?" Martinez looked uncertain. "Are you sure?" "We usually transfer that kind of case to surgery." "He doesn't have time for surgery. I need the tray now." Martinez hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. Thoracotomy in the emergency department was rare, requiring specialized equipment and expertise that most ER physicians didn't have. Emma stepped forward from her alcove. "Thoracotomy tray is in surgical supply cabinet B7, 3rd shelf. The sterile pack expires next month, so it's current. You'll also need the emergency chest tube kit from cabinet B3 and additional suction canisters from the respiratory supply closet." Everyone in the trauma bay turned to look at her. "Doctor?" Webb's expression was a mixture of surprise and growing suspicion. "How do you know what equipment is needed for an emergency thoracotomy?" he asked. "I know what equipment is available and where it's located," Emma replied carefully. Emergency procedures require rapid access to specialized supplies. Have you seen an emergency thoracotomy performed before? I've seen various emergency procedures. It wasn't really an answer, but Dr. Webb didn't have time to pursue it. The patient was crashing, and he needed the equipment immediately. Emma was already moving, retrieving the thoracotomy tray with practiced efficiency, and bringing it to the trauma bay with additional supplies that she somehow knew would be needed. As Dr. Webb worked to stabilize the patient, Emma quietly organized the additional equipment in the exact order it would be needed. Not guessing, not asking for direction, but arranging everything with the kind of precision that came from understanding exactly how the procedure would unfold. "Chest tube tray," Dr. Webb said, and Emma had it ready before he finished the sentence. "Additional suction. Already connected and tested. I need better lighting on the surgical field." Emma had already adjusted the overhead lights and positioned a secondary lamp for optimal visibility. Dr. Webb glanced at her with increasing amazement between his work on the patient. Her anticipation of his needs was too accurate to be coincidental. She wasn't just familiar with emergency supplies. She understood emergency medicine. The patient's vitals stabilized, and Dr. Webb successfully controlled the internal bleeding that would have killed him within minutes. As the immediate crisis passed, and the patient was prepared for transfer to surgery, Dr. Webb finally had a moment to process what had just happened. "Emma," he said quietly, pulling off his surgical gloves, "that was remarkable support. Where did you learn to anticipate emergency procedure requirements like that?" Emma was already cleaning up the unused supplies, organizing everything back to its proper location. "I pay attention to workflow patterns and equipment utilization." "That's not workflow observation. That's clinical knowledge. You anticipated every piece of equipment I needed before I asked for it." Emergency procedures follow logical sequences. Once you understand the medical objectives, the equipment requirements become predictable. Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, studying her with a kind of attention that made Emma visibly uncomfortable. "Medical objectives," he repeated. "That's not language that supply management usually requires." Emma finished her cleanup and prepared to leave the trauma bay. "I should complete my rounds." "Wait." Dr. Webb's voice carried enough authority to make her pause. "I want to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." Emma turned back toward him, her gray-green eyes calm but wary. "Have you worked in emergency medicine before?" "I work in medical supply management." "That's not what I asked." Emma considered this for a long moment, then gave the slightest nod. "I've worked in environments where emergency medical procedures were necessary." "What kind of environment?" "High-stress environments where medical support was critical." Dr. Webb's expression was shifting toward something that looked like recognition. "Military medical support?" Emma's pause was longer this time. "I'd prefer not to discuss my background." "Why not?" "Because it's not relevant to my current position. I think it might be more relevant than you realize." Before Emma could respond, Nurse Martinez approached with obvious excitement about the successful trauma case. "Dr. Webb, that was incredible. I've never seen an emergency thoracotomy performed like that. Where did you learn that technique?" "Forward surgical teams," Dr. Webb replied, but he was still watching Emma. "Combat medicine teaches you to work fast with limited resources." "Combat medicine," Martinez repeated with obvious admiration. "That must have been intense. Emma, did you see how Dr. Webb handled that case? Amazing what military medical training can do." Emma's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested increased alertness. "Military medical training covers a wide range of specialties," she said neutrally. "Have you ever seen anything like that before?" Martinez asked. "I mean, I know you work with medical supplies, but seeing actual emergency procedures must be fascinating." "Emergency procedures are effective when they're performed by properly trained personnel with adequate equipment support." Martinez laughed. "You always sound so technical. Have you ever thought about going to medical school? You seem to know a lot about medical procedures for someone in supply management." "Medical school requires significant time and financial commitment." Quote, "But you're obviously interested in medicine, right? I mean, you pay attention to everything that happens here. Most supply staff just do their job and leave, but you actually watch the procedures and understand the equipment requirements." Emma was becoming visibly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Understanding equipment requirements is part of effective supply management. Dr. Webb had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Emma, can I ask you about the emergency blood refrigerator access codes again? Those codes are restricted to clinical staff with specific training in blood product handling. I have security clearance for all supply areas that affect patient care. Security clearance is different from access authorization. Blood product handling requires certification in transfusion protocols and emergency blood bank procedures. Emma's pause was significant this time. I have the necessary certifications. What kind of certifications? Certifications that were required for my previous position. Which was? Emma gathered her clipboard and prepared to leave. I should complete my supply rounds. Emma, Dr. Webb's voice was gentle but insistent. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I'm trying to understand how someone in medical supply management has clinical certifications and emergency procedure knowledge that most registered nurses don't have. Previous experience. Previous experience as what? Emma was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much information to share. Finally, she said previous experience in situations where medical knowledge was essential for mission success. Military missions? I'd prefer not to specify. Dr. Webb nodded slowly. I understand. But I want you to know that if you ever want to discuss your background, I'm someone who might understand better than most people here. Emma studied his face with careful attention. You have combat medical experience. Forward surgical team, 3 deployments. Afghanistan and Iraq. Then you understand why some experiences are better left undiscussed. I do. But I also understand that those experiences don't just disappear when you transition to civilian life. Emma's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional composure that anyone at Mercy General had seen. No, she said quietly, they don't. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the second trauma case from the multi-vehicle accident. Emma immediately stepped back to allow the medical team to work. But Dr. Webb noticed that she positioned herself where she could observe everything while remaining out of the way. This patient was less critical, a yellow priority case with multiple lacerations and possible concussion. The procedure was routine, but Emma continued to watch with the same focused attention she'd shown during the emergency thoracotomy. As the medical team worked, Emma quietly moved around the periphery of the trauma bay, ensuring that all necessary supplies were immediately available. She didn't interfere or make suggestions, but her presence created a seamless support system that allowed the medical staff to focus entirely on patient care. Dr. Martinez, working on suturing the patient's lacerations, reached for additional gauze without looking up from her work. Emma had anticipated the need and placed it exactly where her hand would naturally reach. Thanks, Martinez said automatically, then paused and looked up. Emma, how did you know I needed that? You're working on deep lacerations with significant bleeding. Additional gauze becomes necessary as the procedure progresses. But I didn't ask for it. Anticipating needs is more efficient than waiting for requests. Dr. Webb was watching this interaction with sharp interest. Emma, that level of anticipation requires understanding medical procedures in real time. How do you know what supplies will be needed at each stage of treatment? I observe patterns and apply logical analysis. That's not pattern observation. That's clinical thinking. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said clinical thinking becomes automatic when medical outcomes depend on resource availability. When have medical outcomes depended on your resource availability? In situations where supply failures meant treatment failures. Military situations? Emma met his gaze directly for the first time since the conversation began. Situations where people died if the right supplies weren't available at the right time. The gravity in her voice cut through the routine noise of the trauma bay. Dr. Webb realized he was looking at someone who had seen medical emergencies where the stakes were life and death, not just in theory, but in reality. The second patient was stabilized and prepared for transfer to the surgical ward. As the trauma bay returned to its normal routine, Dr. Webb found himself alone with Emma as she completed her supply restocking. Emma, he said quietly, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll trust me enough to answer honestly. She didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. Were you a combat medic? Emma's hands stopped moving on her clipboard. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still. No, she said finally. I wasn't a combat medic? Then what were you? Emma looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. Someone who made sure the combat medics had everything they needed to save lives. Medical logistics? Among other things. What other things? Emma secured her clipboard to her cart and prepared to leave. Things that required different kinds of training. What kinds of training? She paused at the trauma bay entrance, looking back at him with something that might have been the beginning of trust. Training that most people hope they'll never need. And with that, she pushed her squeaky cart down the hallway, leaving Dr. Webb with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty that Emma Caldwell was far more than she appeared to be. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, when Mercy General was running on skeleton crew and the kind of quiet tension that hospitals develop during the small hours. Emma wasn't supposed to be there. Her shift had ended at 8, but she'd stayed late to complete a comprehensive inventory audit that administration had requested for the following morning. The supply room was dimly lit, and she was working methodically through surgical equipment manifests when the emergency alert system crackled to life. All available trauma personnel to the emergency department. Mass casualty event inbound. Multiple ambulances en route. This is not a drill. Emma paused in her counting of surgical clamps and listened as the announcement repeated. Mass casualty events were rare at Mercy General, which served a relatively stable suburban population. She could hear the sudden increase in activity throughout the hospital as off-duty staff were called in and emergency protocols activated. She should have gone home. Her work was finished, and mass casualty response didn't technically require additional supply support beyond what was already stocked. But something about the urgency in the announcement made her hesitate. Instead of packing up her materials, she secured her audit paperwork and made her way toward the emergency department. The scene that greeted her was controlled chaos. Dr. Webb was coordinating triage assignments while nurses prepared multiple trauma bays for incoming patients. The first ambulances were already arriving, and Emma could see through the glass doors that more were lined up outside. "What happened?" she asked Nurse Martinez, who was rushing past with an armload of IV supplies. "Chemical plant explosion about 20 miles north," Martinez called over her shoulder. "Preliminary count is 43 workers injured, unknown number of fatalities. We're getting the most critical cases." Emma absorbed this information while automatically assessing the supply situation. Mass casualty events created unpredictable resource demands that could overwhelm standard inventory levels. She could see that the trauma teams were already pulling equipment faster than normal restocking could accommodate. Dr. Webb spotted her near the supply area and approached with obvious relief. "Emma, thank God. I know you're off shift, but we're going to need massive supply support for this. Can you coordinate emergency restocking for all trauma bays?" "Of course. What kind of injuries are we expecting?" "Chemical burns, inhalation injuries, blast trauma, possible crush injuries from structural collapse. It's going to require everything we have." Emma nodded and immediately began mental calculations. Chemical burns would require specialized wound care supplies. Inhalation injuries would need respiratory support equipment. Blast trauma would demand surgical materials, and crush injuries could require emergency amputation kits. Standard hospital inventory wasn't designed for this kind of simultaneous demand across multiple specialties. "I'll need to access emergency supply reserves," she said. "Some of the equipment we'll need isn't part of normal floor stock. Whatever you need, just make sure we don't run out of anything critical." Emma was already moving toward the supply elevators, but she paused and turned back to Dr. Webb. "Doctor, have you dealt with mass casualty events before?" "A few times in combat zones. Why?" "Because the next 6 hours are going to test every system we have. Standard triage protocols, resource allocation, personnel management. Everything needs to be coordinated or we'll lose people who could have been saved." Dr. Webb studied her with sharp attention. "That's a very sophisticated understanding of mass casualty response." Quote, "Mass casualty response requires integration of medical, logistical, and administrative systems under extreme pressure. Failure in any one area cascades into failures across all areas." "Where did you learn about mass casualty coordination?" Emma's pause was brief but noticeable. "Previous experience with large-scale emergency response." "What kind of previous experience?" "The kind where coordination failures had permanent consequences." Before Dr. Webb could ask more questions, the first wave of critical patients began arriving. Emma disappeared into the supply system while the medical teams began the grim work of sorting the savable from the unsavable. For the next 2 hours, Emma moved through the hospital like a ghost, anticipating needs before they were voiced, ensuring that critical supplies appeared exactly where and when they were needed. She seemed to be everywhere at once, restocking trauma bays, coordinating with the blood bank, managing equipment flow between departments. Dr. Webb began to notice that the supply situation, which should have been a nightmare during a mass casualty event, was running with unusual smoothness. Every time he reached for a piece of equipment, it was there. Every time a nurse called for additional supplies, they materialized immediately. The complex logistical dance that usually created bottlenecks and delays during emergencies was somehow working perfectly. At 2:15 a.m., during a brief lull between ambulance arrivals, Dr. Webb went looking for Emma. He found her in a supply staging area she'd created in an unused conference room, surrounded by carefully organized equipment, sorted by injury type and urgency level. She was working with 3 nurses to pre-package supply kits for specific types of trauma, coordinating the entire operation with quiet efficiency. "Emma," he said, approaching the improvised command center she'd created, "this is incredible. How did you organize all this?" "Mass casualty events require pre-positioned resources organized by medical priority," she replied, without looking up from a checklist. "Standard just-in-time supply delivery doesn't work when demand spikes exceed normal capacity by a factor of 10 or more." "Factor of 10 or more," Dr. Webb repeated slowly. "That's a very specific mathematical analysis. Resource planning requires accurate demand modeling." "Where did you learn resource planning for medical emergencies?" Emma finally looked up from her work, and Dr. Webb saw something in her expression that he hadn't seen before, a kind of focused intensity that belonged in command centers, not hospital supply rooms. "I learned it in places where resource planning meant the difference between mission success and watching people die for preventable reasons." "Military logistics?" "Among other things." Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, studying the organized chaos she'd created. The level of sophistication in her operation was beyond anything he'd seen in civilian hospitals. It looked like military medical logistics, the kind of resource coordination that kept field hospitals operational under combat conditions. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I'd really appreciate an honest answer." She waited, her attention focused entirely on him for the first time since he'd known her. "Are you a former military medical corps?" "No." "Then what were you?" Emma hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. "I coordinated medical logistics for special operations units." Dr. Webb felt something click into place in his mind. Special operations medical logistics was a highly specialized field that required extensive training and security clearance. It explained her clinical knowledge, her understanding of emergency procedures, her ability to coordinate complex supply operations under pressure. "What kind of special operations?" "The kind that officially never happened." "Black Ops medical support?" Emma's pause was longer this time. "Medical support for units that didn't officially exist." Dr. Webb stared at her, processing the implications of what she'd just told him. Black Ops medical logistics was among the most classified specialties in the military. People who did that work were carefully selected, extensively trained, and sworn to secrecy about operations that could never be publicly acknowledged. "How long did you do that work?" 8 years. "And now you're working in hospital supply management." "Now I'm doing work that lets me use my skills without compromising classified information." "But why? Why not work for military contractors or government medical facilities? Your experience would be incredibly valuable." Emma's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Because I wanted to help people without having to worry about whether my actions would be classified, compartmentalized, or denied if something went wrong." The weight in her voice suggested experiences that Dr. Webb could only imagine. He'd worked combat medicine, but Black Ops medical support operated at a level of secrecy and risk that few people ever experienced. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the emergency department. One of the chemical plant workers had gone into cardiac arrest, and the medical team was calling for emergency surgical intervention. "I need a cardiac surgery pack immediately," Dr. Webb heard over the intercom. Emma was already moving before he could respond. "Cardiac surgery pack is staged in Trauma Bay 3. Backup equipment is in the conference room staging area." She moved through the hospital corridors with the kind of purposeful efficiency that Dr. Webb recognized from military operations. Not hurried, not panicked, but focused on mission completion with absolute precision. As they reached the trauma bay, Dr. Webb saw Emma transition into a mode of operation that was clearly second nature to her. She positioned herself where she could observe the entire medical procedure while staying out of the way, and began organizing equipment with the kind of anticipatory precision that came from extensive experience with emergency medicine. The cardiac surgery was complex, requiring multiple interventions and several pieces of specialized equipment that weren't part of standard emergency inventory. But somehow, everything the medical team needed was available immediately. Emma seemed to know what Dr. Webb would require before he knew it himself. Cardiac defibrillator. Ready and charged. Emergency pacing kit. Opened and prepared. Cardiac catheterization supplies. Staged and accessible. Dr. Webb worked to save the patient's life while gradually becoming aware that his support was being provided at a level of efficiency that belonged in major trauma centers, not suburban hospitals. Every piece of equipment was not just available but optimally positioned. Every supply was not just present but organized for maximum accessibility. The patient's heart rhythm stabilized, and the immediate crisis passed. As the medical team prepared the patient for transfer to cardiac surgery, Dr. Webb finally had a moment to process what had just happened. "Emma," he said quietly, "that level of surgical support requires understanding cardiac intervention protocols in real time. How do you know cardiac surgery procedures well enough to anticipate equipment needs?" "I've supported cardiac interventions under field conditions." Field conditions, quote, conditions where cardiac surgery had to be performed without full surgical facilities. Dr. Webb felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Combat cardiac surgery. Among other procedures. What other procedures? Emma was already beginning to clean up the surgical area, organizing unused equipment back to its proper storage. Procedures that were necessary to keep people alive until they could reach definitive medical care. Trauma surgery under combat conditions. Trauma surgery under various conditions. Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, beginning to understand the scope of Emma's experience. Combat medical logistics for special operations units meant supporting medical procedures under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Limited resources, extreme time pressure, life and death stakes, and complete secrecy about the operations themselves. "Emma, how many combat medical operations did you support?" "I don't discuss specific numbers." "But it was significant?" "It was my primary responsibility for 8 years." "And the outcomes?" For the first time since he'd known her, Emma smiled slightly. "We didn't lose people for preventable reasons." The simple statement carried enormous weight. In military medical logistics, success was measured by lives saved, missions completed, and personnel returned safely. Emma's quiet pride suggested a record of exceptional performance under impossible conditions. Dr. Webb was about to ask more questions when his pager buzzed with an urgent message. The hospital administrator was requesting his immediate presence in the emergency department command center. "I have to go," he said. "But, Emma, we're not done with this conversation." "I understand." "And Emma, thank you. What you've done tonight, the coordination, the supply management, the surgical support, it's been extraordinary." Emma nodded acknowledgement, but she was already focused on the next task. There were still patients arriving, still procedures to support, still lives to save. But as Dr. Webb walked toward the command center, he found himself thinking about Emma Caldwell in an entirely different way. She wasn't just a hospital supply clerk with unusual competence. She was a highly trained specialist who had spent 8 years supporting medical operations that officially never happened, saving lives under conditions that most people couldn't imagine. And for some reason, she had chosen to work anonymously in a suburban hospital, using her extraordinary skills to ensure that ordinary medical procedures had everything they needed to succeed. The question that Dr. Webb couldn't answer was why someone with her background and abilities was content to work in the shadows, unrecognized and underestimated by everyone around her. But he was beginning to suspect that Emma Caldwell had secrets that went far deeper than military medical logistics, and that her presence at Mercy General was not as random as it appeared. The mass casualty event ended at 6:23 a.m. when the last patient was stabilized and transferred to appropriate care. 43 workers had been brought to Mercy General, and 41 would survive with full recovery expected. The 2 fatalities had died at the scene before emergency services could reach them. By any measure, the night had been a remarkable success. Dr. Webb found Emma in the supply staging area, methodically returning equipment to its proper storage locations with the same precision she brought to everything else. The improvised command center was being dismantled with military efficiency, every item accounted for and properly secured. "Emma," he said, approaching her work area, "we need to talk." She looked up from her inventory checklist, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes for the first time since he'd known her. The adrenaline of the emergency response was wearing off, leaving behind the fatigue that came from 10 hours of intense operational coordination. "About what?" "About who you really are." Emma secured her clipboard and straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm someone who ensured that 41 people went home to their families tonight instead of 41 families planning funerals. That's what you did tonight. I'm asking who you are." Emma was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much truth she was willing to share. Finally, she gestured toward 2 chairs in the empty conference room. "If we're going to have this conversation, we should have it properly." They sat across from each other at the conference table that had served as Emma's command center for the mass casualty response. The morning light was beginning to filter through the windows, and the hospital was transitioning back to its normal rhythm. "My full name is Emma Catherine Caldwell," she began. "I served 8 years in the United States Army, specializing in medical logistics coordination for classified operations." "What kind of classified operations?" "Operations that required medical support in locations where conventional military medical facilities couldn't be established or acknowledged." Dr. Webb leaned forward, his attention completely focused. "Special operations medical support, among other things." "What other things?" Emma hesitated, then seemed to make a decision about how much she was willing to reveal. "I coordinated medical logistics for operations that officially never happened, in countries we were officially never in, supporting personnel who officially didn't exist. Black operations. Deep black. The kind where success meant no one ever heard about it, and failure meant disavowal and denial from everyone involved." Dr. Webb absorbed this information. Deep black operations were the most classified military activities, involving national security interests that couldn't be publicly acknowledged under any circumstances. "What was your official designation?" Emma's pause was significant. "Medical Logistics Coordination Specialist, Special Activities Division." Special Activities Division. Dr. Webb recognized the term from intelligence briefings he'd received during his own military service. "That's CIA. That's compartmentalized information that I'm not authorized to confirm or deny. But you're telling me anyway." "I'm telling you because you've earned the right to know, and because 41 people are alive tonight, because someone understood that I could do more than count bandages." Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what she'd revealed. CIA medical logistics for black operations was work that existed at the intersection of military medicine, intelligence operations, and national security. People who did that work were among the most highly trained and security-cleared personnel in the government. "How did you end up in that kind of work?" "I was recruited out of Army Medical Logistics School. Top of my class, specialized aptitude for resource coordination under pressure, and psychological profile that indicated reliability under extreme stress." "What kind of extreme stress?" Emma's expression darkened slightly. "The kind where people die if you make mistakes, where operations fail if resources aren't available exactly when and where they're needed, and where national security depends on medical support that can't be officially acknowledged." "Can you tell me about specific operations?" "I can tell you about the types of operations I supported, but not about specific missions, locations, or personnel." "What types of operations?" Emma leaned back in her chair, and Dr. Webb could see her accessing memories that she clearly didn't discuss often. Extraction operations where injured personnel needed immediate medical stabilization before they could be moved to safe locations. Deep cover operations where medical emergencies required treatment by personnel who couldn't access conventional medical facilities. Intelligence operations where medical logistics had to be provided without revealing the presence or nature of American involvement. "How many operations?" "In 8 years, Hundreds. Some lasted hours, some lasted months. Some involved single individuals, others involved entire teams. And the outcomes? For the first time in the conversation, Emma smiled with genuine pride. We had a 96% success rate for mission completion and a 98% survival rate for personnel under our medical support. Dr. Webb felt a chill of recognition. Those numbers represented extraordinary competence under impossible conditions. In military medicine, success rates like that were legendary. 98% survival rate under black ops conditions? 98.4% actually. We lost 7 people in 8 years, and 5 of those were due to circumstances beyond medical intervention. What circumstances? Emma's expression went carefully neutral. Circumstances that I'm not authorized to discuss. But 2 deaths were medical failures? 2 deaths were situations where medical intervention wasn't sufficient to overcome the severity of injuries sustained during operations. You remember every case. I remember every person, their names, their injuries, the circumstances of their treatment, the outcomes of their care. When people trust you with their lives, you remember. Dr. Webb was beginning to understand the weight that Emma carried. 8 years of life-and-death medical logistics for the most dangerous operations the government conducted, with personal responsibility for keeping people alive under conditions where failure meant not just mission failure, but the loss of highly trained personnel, whose deaths could never be officially acknowledged. Why did you leave that work? Emma was quiet for a long time, and Dr. Webb could see that he'd touched on something painful. Because after 8 years of supporting operations that officially never happened, I wanted to do work that officially mattered. Those operations didn't matter? Those operations mattered enormously, but they mattered in ways that could never be recognized, acknowledged, or discussed. I spent 8 years saving lives that officially didn't need saving, supporting missions that officially didn't occur, preventing disasters that officially never threatened to happen. And you wanted recognition? I wanted to save lives that I could actually talk about. I wanted to use my skills to help people who could acknowledge that they'd been helped. I wanted to do work that mattered in ways that I could share with the people I cared about. Dr. Webb nodded slowly, beginning to understand Emma's choice to work in hospital supply management. After 8 years of classified medical logistics, she'd chosen work that used the same skills but allowed her to operate in the open. How did you end up at Mercy General? I researched hospitals that served diverse populations with complex medical needs but didn't have sophisticated supply management systems. Mercy General fit the profile of a place where my skills could make a significant difference without requiring me to explain my background. So you deliberately chose a position where you'd be underestimated? I chose a position where I could be useful without being questioned. Until tonight. Until tonight. Dr. Webb leaned forward again. Emma, there's something else I need to ask you about. During the cardiac surgery earlier, your level of procedural knowledge went beyond logistics coordination. You understood the medical interventions themselves. Emma's pause was telling. Medical logistics coordination requires understanding medical procedures. Not to that level. You were anticipating surgical decisions, not just equipment needs. Advanced medical logistics requires advanced medical knowledge. How advanced? Quote, advanced enough to ensure effective support for medical operations under field conditions. Did you receive medical training beyond logistics coordination? Emma was quiet for a moment, then seemed to reach another decision about disclosure. I received cross-training in emergency medical procedures, field surgery techniques, and trauma medicine. How extensive was this cross-training? Extensive enough to serve as backup medical support when primary medical personnel were unavailable. Dr. Webb stared at her. You're saying you were trained to perform medical procedures, not just coordinate supplies for them. I'm saying I was trained to do whatever was necessary to keep people alive until they could reach definitive medical care. That's not logistics coordination. That's combat medicine. That's whatever the mission required. Dr. Webb was beginning to understand that Emma's background was even more complex than he'd initially realized. She wasn't just a medical logistics specialist. She was someone who'd been trained to operate as both logistical coordinator and medical practitioner under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Emma, what was your actual job title in Special Activities Division? Emma's hesitation was longer this time, and when she spoke, her voice was very quiet. Medical Operations Specialist, Tier 1 Support. Tier 1 Support. Dr. Webb felt another piece click into place. That's direct support for the most classified special operations units. That's compartmentalized information. But you're confirming it. I'm acknowledging that my work involved supporting the most critical and sensitive operations conducted by the United States government. Operations involving the most elite special operations personnel. Operations involving personnel whose survival was critical to national security interests. Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, absorbing the full scope of what Emma had revealed. Tier 1 support meant she'd worked directly with units like Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and other special operations forces, whose very existence was rarely acknowledged publicly. How did someone with that level of clearance and responsibility end up working hospital supply management? Because after 8 years of supporting operations where success meant no one ever heard about it and failure meant disavowal and denial, I wanted to save lives in ways that people could actually acknowledge. And you're satisfied with that choice? Quote, Emma looked around the conference room where she'd coordinated the mass casualty response, then back at Dr. Webb. 41 people went home to their families tonight because I was here. Their families will never know that my presence made the difference between life and death, but they don't need to know. The outcome is what matters, not the recognition. But don't you miss the adrenaline? The importance of the work you were doing? Emma smiled slightly. Dr. Webb, what do you think I've been doing here? Do you think coordinating medical logistics for a mass casualty event is less important than coordinating medical logistics for a classified operation? Do you think the lives of chemical plant workers matter less than the lives of special operations personnel? Dr. Webb realized that Emma had found a way to continue doing essentially the same work she'd done in the military, but in a context where she could operate openly and where the people she helped could acknowledge their gratitude. You're still doing the same job. I'm doing the job I was trained to do in an environment where I can talk about it afterward. And you're content with being underestimated and overlooked? I'm content with being useful. Recognition is less important than effectiveness. Dr. Webb nodded slowly, finally understanding Emma Caldwell completely. She wasn't someone who'd left important work to take a lesser position. She was someone who'd found a way to continue her life's work in a context that allowed her to live openly and honestly. Emma, I have one more question. What's that? The people who are making jokes about you in the break room, the ones who are dismissing you as just a supply clerk, how do you feel about their assumptions now? Emma was quiet for a moment, then shrugged slightly. They made reasonable assumptions based on incomplete information. Most people who work hospital supply management are exactly what they thought I was. They had no reason to suspect otherwise. But doesn't it bother you to be underestimated? Dr. Webb, I spent 8 years working in complete anonymity, supporting operations that officially never happened, saving lives that officially didn't need saving. Being underestimated by hospital staff is hardly the most challenging experience I've had with professional recognition. Dr. Webb laughed despite himself. I suppose not. Besides, Emma added with a slight smile, being underestimated can be professionally useful. People tell you things they wouldn't tell someone they perceived as competent. They reveal information they wouldn't share with someone they respected. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from being invisible. Intelligence gathering? Situational awareness. Understanding how systems actually work rather than how they're supposed to work. Identifying potential problems before they become critical failures. Dr. Webb realized that Emma had been conducting ongoing intelligence gathering about Mercy General's operations, using her position as overlooked supply staff to gather information about systemic weaknesses and operational inefficiencies. You've been studying our hospital operations. I've been ensuring that I understand the systems well enough to prevent failures that could affect patient care. And have you identified problems that need attention? Emma smiled more broadly. Dr. Webb, I've been quietly fixing problems that could have affected patient care for 8 months. Tonight was just the first time anyone noticed. Part 6. The Transformation Response. Word of the mass casualty event and Emma's role in its successful management spread through Mercy General with the speed that only hospital gossip could achieve. By the afternoon shift change, Everyone from the cafeteria staff to the chief administrator had heard some version of the story about the supply clerk who'd coordinated medical logistics like a military operation. Dr. Webb found himself fielding questions from colleagues who wanted to understand how someone they'd barely noticed had suddenly emerged as a critical figure in the hospital's most successful emergency response in recent memory. "So she really was military?" Nurse Martinez asked during the afternoon briefing. "I mean, really military, not just someone who likes to sound official." "She was Special Operations Medical Support," Dr. Webb confirmed. 8 years of coordinating medical logistics for classified operations. "Special operations," Martinez repeated slowly. "Like real special operations, not just regular Army Medical Corps?" "The most classified special operations, the military conducts." The briefing room went quiet as the implications of this information settled over the assembled staff. "So when we were making jokes about her talking like a textbook," Nurse Patricia Williams said carefully, "she was actually using terminology from real military medical operations?" Quote, "Terminology from operations that officially never happened," Dr. Webb confirmed. Patricia's face had gone pale. "And when I was complaining about her following procedures, instead of just giving me extra supplies, you were complaining about someone who spent 8 years in situations where procedural failures could result in mission failure and loss of life." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Dr. Foster, who had consistently defended Emma during the break room conversations, spoke first. "So she was never being difficult or bureaucratic, she was being professional. She was applying standards of precision and accountability that she learned in situations where mistakes had life and death consequences." Kevin Morrison, the physical therapy assistant who'd made jokes about Emma's formal language, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "When she said mission success and mission failure, she was talking about real missions? Missions where people's lives depended on her ability to coordinate medical resources under extreme pressure. And we were mocking her for taking supply management seriously. You were mocking her for applying professional standards that were appropriate for her level of training and experience." Lisa Brennan, who'd suggested that Emma had learned customer service from a Pentagon manual, looked genuinely embarrassed. "She actually did learn from military manuals, didn't she? She learned from 8 years of operations where procedural precision was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." The room remained quiet as everyone processed the realization that their casual dismissal of Emma had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of her background and capabilities. Dr. Hawkins, who'd been listening from the back of the room, spoke up. "Does this change how we should be working with her?" "It changes how we should understand her," Dr. Webb replied. "Emma doesn't need different treatment. She needs the same respect we'd show any highly qualified professional. But she's still working supply management. She's working supply management because she chooses to. Her background qualifies her for much more complex and higher-profile positions, but she's chosen work that allows her to use her skills without the classification restrictions that limited her previous position." Patricia Williams raised her hand tentatively. "Should I apologize to her for the complaints about following procedures?" Quote, "You should treat her professionally going forward. Emma isn't looking for apologies, she's looking to do her job effectively. But I feel like I should acknowledge that I didn't understand." Emma spent 8 years working in complete anonymity, supporting operations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. She's accustomed to being misunderstood. What matters to her is being able to do work that makes a difference. Dr. Foster leaned forward. "So the best way to show respect is to let her continue doing her job?" "The best way to show respect is to recognize the level of competence she brings to her job and to trust her professional judgment." As the briefing ended and staff members dispersed to their various departments, the conversations continued in smaller groups throughout the hospital. The story of Emma's background was spreading, but more importantly, the understanding of her capabilities was changing how people interacted with her. Nurse Martinez was the first to approach Emma directly. She found her in the supply room, conducting her normal afternoon inventory with the same methodical precision she'd always shown. "Emma," Martinez said carefully, "I wanted to thank you for what you did last night. I know I didn't understand the complexity of what you were coordinating, but the patients we saved, their families are going to be grateful for the rest of their lives." Emma looked up from her clipboard. "The medical team saved those patients. I just made sure they had the equipment they needed." "Dr. Webb told us about your background, military medical logistics, among other things." Martinez hesitated, then continued. I feel like I should apologize for not recognizing your expertise. There's nothing to apologize for. Most people who work hospital supply management don't have extensive medical logistics training. Your assumptions were reasonable. But I want you to know that I respect what you do, what you've done, the precision, the attention to detail, the way you anticipate needs. I understand now that it comes from real experience with life and death situations. Emma nodded, acknowledgement. Experience teaches you that small mistakes can have large consequences. Is there anything we should be doing differently? To support your work better? Continue focusing on patient care. Everything else will follow from that. Quote, similar conversations occurred throughout the hospital as staff members gradually approached Emma with new understanding of her background and capabilities. Not everyone apologized, but everyone's interaction with her changed subtly, reflecting increased respect and awareness. Kevin Morrison approached her near the end of the week, clearly uncomfortable but determined to address his previous behavior. Emma, I wanted to say something about the jokes I made about your language and procedures. Emma continued her inventory checking, but she was listening. I didn't understand that you were applying real professional standards from real military experience. I thought you were just being overly formal about a simple job. Supply management is simple until resource failures affect patient outcomes. Then it becomes critical. Right, I get that now. And I wanted you to know that I respect your professionalism. Thank you. Is there anything I can do to support your work better? In physical therapy, I mean. Any way we can coordinate better? Emma looked up with genuine interest. Physical therapy equipment has unusual wear patterns that don't follow standard replacement schedules. If you could provide monthly reports on equipment condition and usage patterns, it would help me ensure that replacement equipment is available before failures occur. You want reports on equipment wear patterns. Preventative replacement is more efficient than reactive replacement. Kevin nodded slowly, beginning to understand that Emma's requests for proper procedures weren't bureaucratic obstacles, but professional tools for ensuring operational efficiency. I can do that, monthly reports on equipment condition and usage. That would be helpful. The transformation in how staff interacted with Emma wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were no formal announcements or policy changes. Instead, there was a gradual shift in awareness and respect that reflected deeper understanding of her capabilities and professional background. People began asking her opinion on supply-related issues instead of just making requests. Supervisors began including her in planning discussions for equipment upgrades and workflow improvements. Medical staff began treating her as a specialist consultant rather than a service provider. 3 months after the mass casualty event, Mercy General had settled into a new operational rhythm that reflected the hospital's evolved understanding of Emma Caldwell's role and capabilities. The changes weren't dramatic or officially announced, but they were significant in their cumulative impact on hospital operations. Emma still worked the same schedule, still conducted the same systematic inventory rounds, still maintained the same methodical approach to supply management. But the context of her work had changed fundamentally. Instead of being overlooked for background support, she had become recognized as a specialist resource whose expertise enhanced the hospital's operational capabilities. Dr. Webb found her in the supply room on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, reviewing quarterly inventory reports with the kind of detailed analysis that had once seemed excessive, but now appeared appropriately thorough. How are things working out? He asked, settling into a chair across from her work table. Efficiently, Emma replied, looking up from her reports. Supply variance has decreased by 15%. Emergency equipment availability has improved by 22%. And workflow disruptions due to resource shortages have virtually disappeared. And how are people treating you? Professionally, which is all I wanted. Dr. Webb smiled. No regrets about revealing your background? None. The work is more effective when people understand the reasoning behind the procedures. And you're satisfied with this choice? Using your training for hospital supply management instead of returning to government work? Emma set down her pen and considered the question carefully. Dr. Webb, in 8 years of classified medical logistics, I supported operations that saved lives in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged. Here, I support medical operations that save lives in ways that can be celebrated and shared. Both kinds of work matter, but only one kind allows me to go home at night and discuss my day with people I care about. You prefer being able to talk about your work? I prefer being able to live openly. Classification requirements don't just restrict professional discussion, they restrict personal relationships, social connections, and the ability to share your life with other people. Dr. Webb nodded, understanding. It must have been isolating. 8 years of professional isolation teaches you to value transparency and authentic relationships. Quote, "And you found that here?" Emma gestured around the supply room, which had evolved into something that looked more like a command center than a storage area. Charts on the walls tracked supply usage patterns, equipment, life cycle data, and workflow optimization metrics. A computer terminal provided real-time access to inventory databases and ordering systems. The space reflected the sophistication of the operations it supported. I've found work that uses my training effectively, colleagues who respect my professional judgment, and the ability to discuss my successes and failures openly. What about the people who initially dismissed you? Any lingering resentment? None. Their initial reactions were based on reasonable assumptions given limited information. Once they had better information, they adjusted their perceptions accordingly. That's how intelligent people respond to new data. Dr. Webb laughed. You're remarkably forgiving. I'm practical. Resentment doesn't improve operational efficiency. Speaking of operational efficiency, I heard that the administration is considering creating a new position based on your work here. Something like Director of Medical Logistics Coordination. Emma's expression became carefully neutral. I've heard similar rumors. Would you be interested? The work I'm doing now is effective and satisfying. Additional administrative responsibilities might reduce my ability to focus on direct operational support. But it would come with recognition, increased salary, supervisory authority. Recognition is less important than effectiveness. I'm not interested in positions that prioritize status over operational capability. Dr. Webb studied her thoughtfully. You really don't care about recognition, do you? I care about doing work that matters. Recognition is a secondary consideration. Even after 8 years of working in complete anonymity, especially after 8 years of working in complete anonymity, I learned that the most important work often happens without recognition, and that the most meaningful satisfaction comes from knowing that your efforts made a positive difference, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges your contribution. Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment, then asked, do you ever miss the intensity of your previous work, the high stakes, the critical missions? Emma looked around the supply room, then back at him with a slight smile. Dr. Webb, every day in a hospital involves high stakes and critical missions. The difference is that here, when we save lives, the families can thank us, the community acknowledges our contribution, and we can discuss our successes openly. The intensity is the same, but the context allows for more complete satisfaction. You see hospital work as a continuation of your military mission? I see hospital work as the same mission applied in a different context. Coordinate resources effectively. Anticipate problems before they become critical. Ensure that the people doing life-saving work have everything they need to succeed. The principles are identical. Dr. Webb nodded slowly. And you're content with that? I'm more than content. I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly the work I'm trained to do, in an environment that allows me to live authentically. Their conversation was interrupted by Nurse Martinez entering the supply room with a question about equipment for a complex surgery scheduled for the following day. Emma, we're planning a procedure that's going to require some specialized cardiovascular equipment. Do you need advance notice to ensure availability? What type of procedure? Complex valve repair with possible bypass requirement. Emma pulled up the surgical equipment database on her computer and began reviewing availability and preparation requirements. Primary equipment is available and current. I'll stage backup equipment and ensure that alternative supplies are immediately accessible in case of complications. Do you need me to coordinate with the blood bank for potential transfusion requirements? Would you? That would be incredibly helpful. I'll set up a coordination meeting with blood bank, anesthesia, and surgical staff to ensure integrated logistics planning. Perfect, thank you. As Martinez left, Dr. Webb realized he'd just witnessed the new normal at Mercy General. Emma wasn't just managing supply inventory. She was coordinating complex medical logistics with the same sophistication she'd once applied to classified military operations. This is what you wanted, isn't it? He asked. To use your full capabilities in support of medical operations that you can discuss openly. This is exactly what I wanted. And the hospital benefits from having someone with your level of expertise. The hospital benefits from having effective medical logistics coordination. My background is less important than my current performance. Quote, Dr. Webb stood to leave, then paused at the door. Emma, one last question. Do you think there are other people like you working in positions where they're underestimated because their backgrounds aren't immediately apparent? Emma looked up from her computer with an expression that suggested she'd given this question considerable thought. Dr. Webb, in 8 years of classified work, I met extraordinary people doing ordinary jobs, ordinary people doing extraordinary work, and everything in between. The most important lesson I learned is that competence and character aren't always visible on the surface, and that the most valuable people are often the ones who choose substance over appearance. So, there probably are others. There are definitely others. People who've served in ways that can't be discussed, who've developed skills that aren't reflected in their current job titles, who've chosen meaningful work over prestigious positions. The key is recognizing that professional value isn't always immediately apparent. How do you recognize it? Pay attention to how people work, not just what work they do. Notice who consistently produces results, who anticipates problems, who demonstrates competence without demanding recognition. Often the most valuable people are the ones who are too busy being effective to worry about being noticed. Dr. Webb smiled. Like someone who spends 8 months quietly fixing hospital logistics while everyone assumes she's just counting supplies? Exactly like that. As Dr. Webb left the supply room, he reflected on the broader implications of Emma's story. How many Emma Caldwells were working in positions where their true capabilities went unrecognized? How many people with extraordinary backgrounds were choosing ordinary work because it allowed them to use their skills meaningfully without the complications of recognition or classification? And most importantly, how many critical contributions were being made by people who were content to work anonymously, ensuring that important systems functioned effectively while remaining invisible to those they served? Emma Caldwell had taught Mercy General that expertise comes in unexpected packages, that professional competence isn't always immediately apparent, and that the most valuable people are often those who choose effectiveness over recognition. But perhaps the most important lesson was that everyone deserves to be seen clearly, understood completely, and respected appropriately, not based on assumptions about their position or appearance, but based on the quality of their work and the depth of their character. In the end, Emma Caldwell wasn't remarkable because of her classified military background or her specialized training. She was remarkable because she had chosen to use her extraordinary capabilities in service of ordinary people, finding meaning and satisfaction in work that allowed her to live authentically while making a positive difference in the lives of others. And in a world where recognition often matters more than results, where appearance frequently outweighs substance, and where status commonly overshadows service, Emma Caldwell represented something increasingly rare, a person who measured success by the effectiveness of her contribution rather than the visibility of her position. The quiet revolution at Mercy General wasn't about discovering a hidden hero or revealing a secret identity. It was about learning to see clearly, judge fairly, and respect appropriately. It was about understanding that the most important work is often done by people who choose service over recognition, substance over status, and effectiveness over ego. They had said virgins don't serve, but they had never seen the service record of the woman they called Virgin of Death, someone who had spent 8 years ensuring that death was denied its victory in the most dangerous places on earth, and who continued that mission every day in the quiet corridors of a suburban hospital where every life saved was a victory that could finally be celebrated openly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.